Einstein. There was a thing from a Google employee. You almost certainly heard about Google's gender equity practices in the workplace. Um, it's inspired a lot of discussion, lots of posts, topic of multiple podcasts that I followed. So I thought I would. So I have a 6-year-old daughter, and it's rather important to me that when she enters the world of work, hopefully when she's graduates from college, or maybe before that with a part-time situation, who knows what the world will look like in another. She's 6, so we're looking at 12 years basically. Who knows what it'll look like. But point is, I love my daughter. I want her to face a fair world. I want her to do well, be a happy, productive adult. So I'm going to contribute to this discussion, although I am skeptical of the outcome, of the impact I'll have. But hopefully I'll keep this relatively concise and cogent. It's a big topic. I want to break it down into the elements as I see them and go from there. All right, so something that is not helpful in this, if your goal is to actually achieve gender equity, is to keep beating on things that were a problem 30 years ago but are not there anymore, right? And just accusing people of things that are just not true, right? So if you were to go back, like I can remember when I was growing up, there were policies in place that were just overtly discriminatory. I mean, written policies. The superintendent of this school has to be a man. I mean, it was like, boom, right there. Overtly discriminatory. Or the principal has to be a man. Those are gone, right? There is no institutional overt bias against women. Every now and then something will come up where there is an overt bias. And when it does, it makes huge news because it is so rare today, right? So in general, the culture and the participants in American society have come to realize that barring some legitimate physical thing, that gender bias is not a good thing. That it is and they're not good. So what needs to stop, the very first thing, right? Because the only thing it does is establish hostility and eliminates the pathways of communication. They're no longer listening to you. Right? As soon as you go into a company and accuse them of institutional, rigorous, systematic gender bias, they just discount you as a nut. Right? They're just like, well, you just clearly don't know what's going on, at least not at our company, because no, there are still a handful of crotchety old men who hold gender biases that they act upon, but that is such a rarity today. Certainly not amongst those who are responsible for growing a successful business, because it's just demonstrated that is just a horrible, horrible strategy. Right? So that's something that isn't a problem. And as soon as you make that assertion, right, whatever feminist you may be, as soon as you make the assertion that the problem is pervasive institutional bias, right, I have to discount everything you say from that point forward, because you have demonstrated to me that you have a severe bias that you are not going to be able to look past and actually examine the data. Right? And I'm just not interested in it. I'm not here to convert zealots, right? If you are a man-hating feminist zealot, I'm not going to engage you in a discussion. I'm just going to let you believe what you want to believe, knowing that you are wrong. And while I am kind enough to state that factually, most people, both genders, as soon as you make that statement, they are discounting you in the same way. So if you want to be taken seriously, right? If you want to contribute to the conversation, hopefully work towards a successful resolution, the first thing you've got to get past is hating men and hating and this unfounded belief that there is a pervasive institutional bias against women in the workplace, because that's just not what's going on anymore. Those days are gone. Right. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at what actually is going on in the workplace that makes it difficult for women to achieve the same level of success in some areas as men. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about professions that require a very particular skill set. Some examples would be like computer programming, others are medicine, and that's where most of the people who are concerned about gender biases against women in the workplace focus. And it's interesting because there are entire sectors of the economy that are just completely foreclosed to men, right? That you can do it if you're a woman, and you can't do it if you're a man. And no one seems to be concerned about gender equity there, right? No one is out there saying, well, we need to do something about the fact that almost every single drug rep today is a young, attractive female, right? What happened to the opportunity for young men to become pharmaceutical reps, right? No one's making that argument. No one's making that up. Or why is it that every single yoga pants entrepreneur is a woman? Why can't a man be as successful as Jessica Nigri? Why is it that we have this huge gender gap between the women who are able to make a living off of Instagram just by wearing yoga pants, but no men are able to do that, right? Why? We need to do something about that level of unfairness, right? And that's just the legal things, right? As near as I can tell, male prostitutes are just a myth. Right? The entire prostitution sector is completely controlled by women, and no one seems to be concerned about that. So no one's out there pounding the gavel saying we need more gender equity in prostitutes. We need to increase the opportunity and equality for male prostitutes, right? So I'm just observing the humor in that situation. I'm not actually advocating that they take any of those positions, although I am going to take a look at the pharmaceutical sector, because it does in a few minutes, because it does have some interesting patterns that we should look at. But I'm not looking at firemen or teachers or any of the many sectors where there appears to be no problem with gender equity. I'm looking in particular at the STEM classes that we talk about, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or is that medicine? Engineering and medicine, where women seem to do significantly less. And the question is, why do we want women to do better in those? And the reason is because they are generally considered to be very nice. It's a very nice part of the economy to work in, right? You are rewarded for your merit. At least this is the theory. You're rewarded for your merit, and you are trained for that. It's not something that you just luck into in general. And they are jobs that have a great deal of societal value and command a great deal of societal respect without having to be somehow weird, like a yoga pant model, right? You show up at a party and say, well, what do you do for a living? I'm a yoga pant model, right? You're going to get, you show up and say, well, what do you do for a living? And it's like, oh, I'm a mechanical engineer. And they're like, oh, that's cool, right? It's great, good for you. That's a nice, solid respect. So it is desirable, not just for women, but just across society. They're just desirable jobs to have. And we've also identified that as a problem, where there is a noticeable gender gap, both in the levels of employment and also in the compensation levels. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I think that's generally the focus that most people have is on those. Okay, so the course of one's career usually is going to follow a similar arc. And the first thing you're doing is like, well, I'm 22-ish, 23-ish. I need a job, right? And then out there in the greater world, there are companies who say, well, we needed an employee, but we need a particular type of employee. So there are two possibilities. And when it comes to STEM, what we observe is that there are much less women, young women, 22, 23 years, who are entering the workplace as those young engineers, as those young science researchers, as those young computer programmers. And so there are a couple of possibilities that we should look at. The first one would be is that there's a discrimination going on. And as I've already said, that's just not happening, right? There are no hiring committees out there saying, okay, this job is for a man, let's find a man. Right? That just doesn't exist. Even in small companies, right, where you have a hiring selector of one person, he's not sitting there saying, oh, I need to get a young man for this position. Right? He is looking at the best available set of candidates. Now, there could be some subtle biases involved there, like maybe he's a man and he believes that men are better at that job. I don't believe that there's any evidence to suggest that that's going on. Every broad-based survey of mid-level managers, who are usually the ones who are doing those hirings, indicates that in the areas of STEM, there's no widespread belief that hiring managers see men as inherently better at the task associated with that job than women. So what do I think is going on there? So here is what I think is going on. There's been a very big push in the past 10 years to get women prepared for those entry positions. And I think those are good. That's a good thing. I think it's so. Going back in the early aughts, you had various programs who were out there identifying 7th and 8th grade girls, saying, "Oh, you're good at math. Let's try to gear you towards a career in math." All right, so that is what we call an external driver of demand, right? Because at the same time, you had many young 7th grade boys who just like, well, I just like math. I'm going to spend as much time as I can studying math or computer science. Right? And you are never going to engineer with a program an external driver that is as motivating as an internal driver. Right? So I appreciate the efforts, and I think they should continue. I think that there needs to be significant opportunities for young women, probably more so than young men, because it's just needed. But I just don't see that they're ever going to be as effective until we can. So the consequence of that is, by the time you get to 22, right, you have a pool of young women who are prepared to be engineers and computer programmers because of the structure around them. And you have a pool of young men who are prepared to be engineers and technical types because they are internally driven. They are fascinated by the technology. They've spent as much time as possible. Those pools are never going to be equal. They're never going to be equal in number. if you were to dedicate enough resources, you could get women's numbers in those pools up to equality. But I can tell you, as someone who has looked at the influx of resumes for a technical position, that you just don't get for entry-level positions, you just don't get the number of qualified female applicants. Forget about qualified, just the number of raw applicants, right? It's going to be 6 or 7 guys for every girl who's so that means then that if you're just looking at it on a purely random number basis, unless you are just deliberately discriminating against young men, you're going to end up with more young men because there's just more in that labor pool who are looking for those jobs. But that's just the raw numbers. Then we get back to so if you have a young person, regardless of gender, who is the product of an external motivator to get them prepared for that job, and you have a young person, regardless of gender, who is the result of an internal motivator for that job, by the time they get to 22, 23, that kid that has had an internal motivator has spent much more time in the subject than the one who has the external. The external motivator is going to attend classes, they're going to attend conferences. They may even have a mentor in some of the better programs. They're going to do all, but then when it comes to the point where it's like, okay, it's Friday night, it's 7 p.m., what are you going to do? Right? Those with the external motivators, oh, it's Friday night, I'm going to a movie. I'm going to those with the internal, oh, I have some time. I'm going to dig into this math book. I'm going to tinker with this computer program. I'm going to see if I can't learn how to use this AutoCAD feature, right? And over the course from the time they're 14 or 15 to the time they're 22, those Saturday nights have added up so that the one with the internal motivator is just much more prepared for the interview. And that comes out in the interviews, right? I'm telling you, as someone who's sat in these interviews for a technical position, you got some kid there, regardless of gender, because it's usually a guy, and you got some kid there whose sum total of preparation is the classes he's had at university, and then maybe some time he spent with a mentor, and then you've got another kid who's like, well, no, I've volunteered, I've contributed to these open source projects. With these results, right? Or I subscribe to these magazines, and I've read up on all of these current techniques and technologies that are not part of any university's curriculum yet. Well, the hiring choice is obvious, right? It's just it's not a question of like these are equally qualified applicants. I'm going to take the guy. No, it's like, oh no, this kid really loves the job. Right? It is going to consume his entire attention, at least until he gets out in the world and or she, and at least until the kid gets out and establishes a family and friendships and stuff. But right now, this kid is going to be the model entry-level employee. He's going to come in, he's going to dive in, or she, because I continually use he because that's what the by far the prevalence is. But I will say this, that over the years, whenever I have encountered young women who met that same threshold that I'm talking about, they have thrived in those entry-level jobs with every bit of the same as the young men, right? So I have encountered young women who have come in and they're like, oh no, I've contributed to open source projects, and I subscribe to MSDN and Wired and blah blah blah, and we've given them the job, and they have done equally well to the young men who've had those. So there's no intrinsic bias. There's no reason why young men are better at that than young women. Young men just seem to have that their internal motivators are skewed in those areas. And it's not by choice, right? If you were to go to all these young men who end up at 22 in that situation, and you were to survey them at 15 and 16 and say, well, it's Friday at 7. Would you have preferred to go to that party? And they're going to say, yeah, I would have. I wasn't invited. Whereas the young women are like, even they just have better social structures in their teenage years. They're much more likely to get invited to the party, not for reasons that they've engineered. It's just the way the culture is, right? If you are a person throwing a party for 16 and 17-year-old kids, you're just going to invite more young women just because you want your party to be a success, and your party is not going to be a success if it's all guys, right? And so you have to invite more young women. So there's a cultural bias against young women spending that extra time in these areas that we would like to move. So I don't have a solution to that, right? Right? I don't know that there is a solution to that. First of all, right? What are you going to do? You're going to pass a law saying that every party catered to teenagers has to have the same proportion of nerdy young men as young women? Is that a solution that anyone wants to advocate? So that when they all get to 22, they're all equally prepared? No, I could say this isn't a unique observation, right? It is an entire genre of teen movies about nerdy young men who would really much rather go to the party than be at home working on science. So that has a consequence, though, that is not desirable, in that those nerdy young men who weren't invited to the party on Friday and Saturday night, when they're 22, they're better prepared for that job as a computer programmer than the young woman who did go to the party, who was invited to the party and had well-rounded social structures in place. It's just the way that it is. I don't have a solution for that, but it would be great if there were people out there working on that, because that is the first real problem. The first real problem is getting those young women. Now, I believe that there are people, like there are several projects specifically geared at grabbing girls, not teenagers, because by then their appetites are already fully formed, but getting girls, like 8 and 9-year-old girls, to show them how interesting and rewarding it is to build computer programs and other technology. I'm very hopeful that those will have a positive result, that as those young girls grow up. Now, who knows what's going to, when you develop an interest in the opposite sex, that's a primal drive that's hard to compete with. So I don't know what you do to get that 15-year-old girl to say, no, I think computer programming is cool and all, but yeah, there are going to be attractive young 16-year-old boys at this party. I'm gonna go to this party instead of practicing my coding on Friday night. Anyway, so those are the barrier. That's the primary barrier to entry, is the focus, the external motivators versus internal motivators. And I don't know how you fix that, to be honest with you. I don't know. It would be great if more people were working on that. I try to do it with my daughter, but that's just me and my daughter. It would be nice to see systematic, widespread programs addressing that problem. If it is a problem. Is it a problem? I don't know. Is it a problem that there aren't more young girls not going to parties and instead staying at home pursuing nerdy pursuits while Monty Python is playing in the background? I don't know if that's a problem or not. Maybe the fix is to fix the social skills of the socially ostracized young men, so that they are not as prepared for those jobs when they get to 22. But their preparation is lowered to a point of equality with the socially adept young women. All right. So that's the first issue, is preparation from the ground level for these entry level jobs. Okay. So that's, having addressed the barrier to entry level that women suffer. I want to look now at at promotions, as well as when you hire for an advanced position. This is an area of concern. There is much less promotion and at less attractive salaries for young women once they are in the workplace, or not just young women, women in general. So there's been a lot of focus on the negotiation skills of men versus men are much more willing to take a hard position on salary negotiations, and so I'm not going to delve into that. I think those are valid, and there are lots of programs to help women master the arts of negotiating salary and promotions, and I think that's fully recognized and fully valid as an area of concern. And I'm wanting to focus on the things that are overlooked, right? So there's a thing that happens that everyone knows about, but no one recognizes, and consequently no one is attempting to do anything about. And that is, so just structurally within the workplace, there is a risk premium to bring in or promote a woman for a senior position. Senior position is going to vary from organization to organization, but and there are those who just want to deny that this risk premium exists, and everyone who examines it says, well, yeah, you're just ignoring the truth. You're just ignoring facts. So the first one is that culturally there is an expectation that women will be much more likely to disrupt their work life because of pressures in their home life. Right? There was a Blackish episode about this where Bo is facing a promotion and she's asked over and over again, can you do this job with 4 kids? And no man has ever had that question asked to him, right? No guy with 4 kids ever goes into the promotion meeting and they say, yeah, so you've got 4 kids and a 5th one on the way. Do you think you can manage your home life and still meet the demands of the job? So the question then becomes, is that valid? Right? Is it a valid risk premium? Right? So you've got an organization that has a key position that needs to fill, and they want to get the individual in that job that will be the most dedicated and the most talented. And it doesn't matter how much more talented the one person is, if the job is going to be significantly secondary to other concerns, whatever those concerns may be, then the obligation of the hiring entities and the promotion entities is to take the one who may be less talented but will be more reliable. Right? Reliability, in the absence of just some weird talent gap, like some unique specialization or just a glaring deficiency on the one part, but in general, reliability is going to win out over a modest talent gap. And my observation is that within American culture, yeah, a woman is much more likely to say, yeah. So I'm going to voice the 2 mindsets. So the man is like, it is in my best interest for my 6-year-old daughter to not only keep my job, but demonstrate how good I am at my job so that I can get promoted, so that I can provide my daughter with the things in life that she will need growing up. And there are men who the opposite attitude is, no, the most important thing in my life is my 6-year-old daughter. I have my job merely so that I can provide for her. But when it comes down to the decision between which is going to be the primary importance to me, it is going to be my 6-year-old daughter. Now, I think that all of us, in theory, agree with that second position. And all of us would hope that every parent takes that position. But for as long as there have been employers and employees, the employer wants to identify the employee who has that first position. The one who says, yeah, we know that if it's a choice between being home for dinner or working 3 hours late to get the project done, this employee is going to stay and get the work done. Yeah. Now, societally, we all respect that guy. Says, nope, I'm going to go home so that I can have dinner with my family. They need to have me there, and that's very important to them. But from a productivity standpoint within an organization, it is going to favor the guy who's like, it would have been nice if I could have made it home for dinner, but the project had to be done, and I had to stay late from work, and my family's just going to have to understand that. So, so given those two mindsets, we look at where women and men respectively are going to fall. Now, the ones who are completely dedicated to their family are first of all going to be a minority, right? And I'm glad for that. I don't want to live in a culture where family is subordinate to employment. So I'm glad that but as an employer, when it comes time for promotions, I'm looking for the one who is closer to that dedication. And I don't know that there is good data on where women fall on that range. But my anecdotal observation is that women much more forcefully align with the idea that they are going to subjugate the obligations of their job to the obligation of their family. Men are more inclined to identify with their work. Women are much more likely to identify with their right. So if you were to just ask people to describe themselves, the first thing out of every man's mouth is his job, right? So this is what even the enlightened ones, right? I'm a social activist, right? Or I'm a civil liberties lawyer, right? Even the liberal ones, they self-identify with their employment, whereas he probably has kids, probably has a wife, who knows? But he is much less likely to, the first thing out of his mouth. So a woman is much more, well, I have 3 kids, or that's just the way that it is. So this is what I was going back at the very beginning, right? So this is just a tough nut to crack, right? We're talking about fundamental decisions about American culture and American way of life. And I don't think we can even agree on which is the preferable. It's like, I think that let me take that back. So I do think we all agree that as individuals and as a matter of personal respect, we want people to prioritize their families over their job. But within the context, at the same time, holding the same opinion as a obligation to my organization as a promotion or hiring manager, I've got to recognize that the individual who is much more focused on the career, that is willing to subjugate the family to the career, is going to be the better candidate to hire or promote to a position of authority. So I can have a personal opinion about the way I think people should live their lives, but I have a professional obligation to hire someone that is absolutely contrary to my personal opinion. And you see that is a huge driver in the reason that women and men are promoted at different rates. Whether it's true or not, I happen to think that it probably is true. Within the professional context, women are viewed as much more likely to allow their home life to disrupt their professional life. And I will say this too. So I have worked with women who have progressed up the scale, and there are a handful of them I have encountered who are like, no, you just got to understand that my family is more important, and I'm so talented that I'm going to get that promotion anyway. But most of them had to compromise that, and had to, in order to get those promotions, in order to get those advancements, they had to acknowledge that they were just as willing as men up for those positions to stay late, to not take maternity leave if it was at a crucial time in the company's calendar year or evolution, right? And it's unfortunate, I guess, but it's the truth. So that's the one risk premium, right? Is that rightly or wrongly within our culture, we recognize that women are more likely to allow their home life to disrupt their professional life. So if I'm looking at promotion or advancement, not even all things being equal, right? But I've got to give the man more credit for reliability than the woman, just as a matter of risk, just a general risk pool. It's unfortunate. I wish it wasn't the case, but it's true. And it's not just men doing that, right? If you look at women on those hiring committees, they are asking those same questions. They're the ones. Right? This isn't a question of feminism or misogyny. This is just the way that the world works, right? It's not like, oh well, if these men and women who are on these hiring and promotion committees were all feminists, it would be a different world. No, even if they were all feminists, hardcore feminists, they still have a fiduciary obligation to promote and hire the best candidate. And the risk premium associated with women in American culture is just there. It's just a thing. I don't know how you fix it. I don't know how you compensate for it. I don't know that we want to. I don't know that we want to say that maybe you could go the other way. Maybe you could make it just as likely that men are going to be disrupting their professional life with personal issues as well. Maybe get them all addicted to drugs or something. I don't know. But as we stand today, if you're facing a promotion, there is a risk premium associated with a woman. Even if she doesn't have kids currently, right? If she is in the childbearing years, you're like, well, she can get pregnant. She's going to want maternity leave. And if we are facing, an important campaign of some kind, a development cycle or preparing to go public, and she says, well, I've got to go take off time to have a baby, right? That's just a risk, right? So unless she's, a woman can be very deliberate and say, if that happens, I'll be out 3 days and I'll be back on the job, which women do, right? Unfortunately. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I don't know what to do there. It's just, like I was saying earlier, we're not facing institutional problems, right? We're facing fundamental core cultural problems of societal realignment. Right. So that's the first one. The other risk premium is litigation. Right. So if I have a promotion or I'm hiring someone into an advanced position, and that's a guy, and I realize that he doesn't work out. We're 6 months in and he doesn't work out. I'm like, well, Bill, you're gone. Sorry, we gave you your shot. You weren't able to live up to the standard. We got to go a different way. He goes away. If I face that same situation with a woman, it is much more complicated. Before I can just fire her, I have got to establish cause. It's got to be very well documented. Because there are just legal recourse. If she, right, particularly if I am in an organization that is already male heavy and I'm trying to transition to a more gender mix, to a better gender mix, then there is going to be a point there where I've like, well, if I'm going to fire her, it's got to be clear that it's not because she's a woman. Right? I know why I'm firing her. I know that she's not doing the job that we wanted her to do, but I can't just fire her the way that I could have. So that then affects the hiring up front. So I've got to be much more certain of a woman's ability to not face that situation, because I don't want to have to keep those records and details, and so that becomes a risk premium up front too, right? So I'm like, well, if I hire a guy, right, it's a carefree hire, right? Whereas if I hire a woman, particularly in an organization that's already male heavy, or into a role that has historically been male heavy, like into you could have a broader organization, but your computer programming group, then I know that I've got to be much more diligent in my oversight. There is a cost associated with her, a management cost, because I can't just say, okay, I'm going to hire her and see how she's doing in 6 months. And because in 6 months, if she's not doing well, I can't just fire her, right? Because she's got legal recourse, right? She can go in and demonstrate a history of gender bias because we have never hired women before. And if I don't have the documentation and the processes in place to demonstrate that no, she was not fired then the presumption is that she was fired because of gender biases. So that makes me much less likely, especially if I'm already male heavy, to hire a woman, and that's a problem. Now again, it's a hard problem. It's a difficult problem. You don't want to remove those legal recourse, right? Because that legal recourse exists for a reason, right? Without that legal recourse, we run the risk of returning to the situation where there was institutionalized gender bias, and there was a transition period there where the official documentation was removed, but there was still a understood pattern. Right, so there was a period, so prior to the mid-'60s, it was just a matter of school board documentation that principal and superintendent roles had to be men. Then you had this wave of feminists says that's just unfair. So they removed the official documentation, but it was still a well-known pattern, right? So the school board wouldn't officially hire only men, but the likelihood of you being hired as a woman was just absurdly low, because that was just the unspoken or the understood principle that they would only hire men for those leadership positions. Right. So fortunately, that has changed. Right, in education. Right, there are women principals and superintendents, and no one looks askew at them. I don't think there's been a gender-based lawsuit against an education institution of any note in 20 years. So it would be great to translate that into the broader economy, but I don't know how we get there, right? I mean, the difference was public education was a public institution. So it was susceptible to public oversight, whereas individual corporations are not. They are only susceptible to legal oversight, and that is the problem. The one way that you could go and this is, I don't recommend this, I'll get them, would be to make it much harder to fire the men. That you gave men who were fired without good documentation much better legal recourse than they currently have, so that when you face that decision, you had equal choices as far as a risk assessment of legal recourse should you have to fire them. But that just doesn't. But that would be a huge burden on businesses that I don't see being easily implemented. There would be such a resistance to that. I think it would be a good idea. I think there are a lot of people who would favor making it harder to fire all people, not just the women and people of color. But I don't see that happening. Okay. Me, the pharmaceuticals industry is just a very enlightening example of what happens in the. So you have these theoretical concepts, these beliefs that are not founded on data. So you have feminist activists here, Slate's XX Gabfest types, which I love Slate XX Gabfest, but they're just delusional. They just don't understand the way the world really works when it comes to the way men think and women think. So for me, the pharmaceutical industry is a very good example of what I'm talking about. It highlights what really goes on in the world, as opposed to these conspiracy theories that are promoted by the hard feminists, like Slate's political or XX Gabfest, right? I love XX Gabfest. Listen to it every week, but they are quite certain that there is this male patriarchy that is out there deliberately just hates women and wants to keep them down. Right? They don't seem to understand that they're just the way the world works, and it's just a matter of interaction with people with biases across the board, including women. So when we look at the pharmaceutical industry, so if you were to go back 25 years, early 90s, and you were to look at pharmaceutical reps, right, what you would find is that it was a sales position, right? So you had a new drug, you would assign it to a pharmaceutical rep. That rep's job would be to make contact with doctors, ingratiate themselves so that your opinion was taken seriously, and the end result, and then you would return to that doctor with follow-ups, and the end result being that you would increase the sale of that drug. And then what pharmaceutical companies began to notice was that, hey, attractive young women are much better at that job. Not because the young men don't have product knowledge, or they're not as friendly or sociable or as eloquent, but just the reality of the world is that most doctors are men, and men, right, when they look out of they're like, well, I'm busy today, and the nurse, their assistant or nurse or whoever's up front says, doctor, there's a pharmacy rep here to talk to you. And they look out their door and they see a 24-year-old guy, or they see a 24-year-old attractive young woman. They're just much, much more likely to say, well, yeah, let that 24-year-old attractive young woman back to talk to me. Now, you can say that's wrong. It's unfair to the young men. There are an infinite number of problems with that structure that I wish were not there. But if anybody has a way to make a 35-year-old man just as eager to talk about an esoteric topic that he has no initial interest in with a 22-year-old boy, or a 24-year-old, let's say 24-year-old guy, as he is to talk to a 24-year-old woman, I want to know what that trick is, because as near as I can tell, it just doesn't exist. So there are female doctors, and I'm sure that female doctors would prefer but the problem with that is that female doctors are much more professional, right? They're not going to look out there and say, "Oh, that's a good-looking 24-year-old guy. Send him on back." And they're not going to look out there and say, "Oh, that's a 24-year-old girl. Now send her away." The way that a 35-year-old male doctor is, right? That's just the way the world works. I disagree with it. I wish it was different. I am just the messenger. So then, beginning in the early 90s to by the mid-aughts, it had complete if you were looking at the early 90s, sales reps was heavily skewed towards men, just like all professional positions were at that time, as women hadn't overcome the college education gap yet, which they now have. But by the mid-aughts, right? So if you were in the early 90s and you said pharmaceutical sales rep, right? The image that would come to anyone knowledgeable's mind would be a young man in his mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s, clean shaven, highly presentable. He wants to make a good impression, probably wearing a suit, carrying a sample case. By the mid-aughts, that guy is gone. It is now 100% a young woman, professionally dressed, probably in a skirt with some conservative but still sexy heels, very well groomed, carrying that same sample case. So the entire nature of that class of jobs, pharmaceutical sales reps, changed because of the recognition of the industry. They're like, "Oh, yeah, a young woman is just much more likely to get the response we want." It wasn't a gender bias. They didn't set out and say, "Oh, we are just going to decide that we would rather have women in that position than men." That was not what happened. It was a reaction to the way the world works. They are looking to get the outcome they want in the market they are in, and they just reacted to that. So that was 10 years ago, that transition. So now and then, if we look at the advancement situations, and we don't see the same takeover. So in theory, that should have progressed up the ladder of the pharmaceuticals, right? That we should have had much like almost an exclusively mid-level management of women now, and we don't see that. And that gets back to what I was saying about the risk premiums. Like, yeah, if the pharmaceutical rep, right, the entry-level job, if she is unable to fulfill her obligations because of other priorities, or if we need to fire her, right, there's no way she can claim bias. But when it comes to people who are making important decisions about the long-term, we need to know that they're going to be reliable. We need to know that they're not going to be out of the market for 3 years to have a kid and raise it for the first 3 years, right? Before we invest in that heavily, we need, and so the risk premium kicks in above that. So we don't see the way we would expect. We would expect, since the entire pharmaceutical rep layer is now female, why doesn't that rise up? And it goes back to and it's not institutional, right? The pharmaceutical industry has already demonstrated that they are very willing to transition from a male-dominated workforce in a workspace to a female-dominated work populace in that same workspace. So it can't be that the pharmaceuticals are deciding that, oh no, it's okay to hire women sometimes, but on these, and when it comes to the managers, that needs to be gender-based, and we need to have that be, right? That's not what's going on, right? It's a much harder problem to solve. It is cultural, and it's more than just cultural. It would involve compromising values culturally that we agree with, right? We agree that people in general should prioritize their family for sure, but probably even their friendships and other social obligations over their profession, right? We all agree with that. But the reality is that the individuals who compromise that, right? And Devil Wear Prada is a very good fictional allegory for this, right? But we are sure, but that we know that the individuals who are willing to compromise that value that we hold to be a good value as a culture are a much better employee for an organization. So it's not just like, oh, that's wrong, we'll just change it, right? We've got just a fundamental conflict within our culture that is difficult to resolve. So I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a fix. I just want to see the discussion be a valid discussion. Not setting up a bunch of straw men or non-existent entities, non-existent problems. Yeah. So this wasn't nearly as cogent as I was hoping for. I was hoping for a tight 15 minutes, but I'll put it out there for the world. Who knows? Maybe 3 or 4 people will watch it. I feel better for having recorded it anyway.